The dispensary glass flows like frozen tears across the ruins of Pharmacia Benedictus. Here, on sublevel Gamma 7 of Hive Sorrowfall, melted pill bottles float within the slag like amber insects in resin, each one a small mercy that survived the cleansing fire, only to become a monument to its own impossibility. This corner establishment, 12 meters by 8, once facilitated commerce that the 41st millennium has forgotten how to name: the systematic alleviation of human suffering. Archaeological reconstruction reveals inventory manifests that read like heretical scripture. Somnus mild, for shift workers whose 8-hour rotations, not the brutal 20-hour cycles of modern hive industry, still left them sleepless. Dream ease for minds haunted by nightmares that were personal rather than prophetic. Grief balm, dispensed to the recently bereaved as if individual loss warranted individual attention rather than collective stoicism. The motto endures above the shattered entrance, etched in brass that survived purification flames: comfort in service of the soul. Each word represents a concept that would now trigger inquisitorial investigation. This was not black market commerce, but registered civic infrastructure, its services deemed essential to populace well-being. Citizens presented prescription chits signed by wellness coordinators, functionaries whose job was alleviating human distress rather than maximizing productivity through controlled suffering. Behind reinforced glass, now fused into abstract sculptures by cleansing fire, stood medications designed for individual comfort: confidence mild for social anxiety, patience deep for managing difficult relationships, focus calm for concentration without stimulant addiction. Each bottle represents a society that viewed emotional pain as a problem to solve rather than spiritual weakness to endure. But it is Mrs. Valdris's ration card, discovered beneath the collapsed counter, that provides our most precise window into this vanished world. Hab row 73, stair C, age 53, ration class green. The date, 3 days before the cleansing. The stamps, somnus mild and grief ease. The signature, Elena Caney, licensed comfort pharmacist. The paper itself, cream-colored and unstained, suggests a transaction conducted in peace. What manner of civilization dedicates resources to individual emotional comfort rather than collective survival? What ideological framework views personal solace as compatible with social duty? The fragments whisper of administrators who tolerated managed relief, a civic anesthesia against the wear of attrition. Where the war machine now demands constant vigilance, here it once looked away for an hour and allowed the organism to rest. More troubling? What force could be so threatened by this gentle commerce that it required not mere closure, but systematic elimination? Not just of the shops, but of the very concept they represented. The melted glass catches hive light, creating rainbow patterns across walls that once advertised restful sleep and peaceful thoughts. In 3 days, Mrs. Valdris would learn that comfort itself had been declared enemy of the soul. The corner where dreams were sold became the corner where mercy died. Sorrowfall operated on managed contentment, and the bureaucracy meant it. Civic budgets allocated 7% to pharmacological solace, audited quarterly like any essential service. The drugstore network functioned as regulated infrastructure. Grief counselors prescribed sorrow ease for the bereaved. Shift supervisors distributed focus calm for concentration issues. Pediatric clinics administered night rest for children's trauma dreams. This was not contraband commerce, but civic policy. Systematic reduction of human suffering through institutional design. Clerk Jorik Thane embodied this system's gentle logic. His morning ritual included confidence mild for social anxiety, 2 tablets that transformed stutter into steady speech, trembling hands into reliable service. The medication cost 12 credits monthly from a salary of 300. His supervisor included pharmaceutical allowances in departmental budgets, viewing chemical assistance as preferable to disciplinary action. With panic converted to breath, Thane processed 56 forms per hour and stayed late when conscience, not fear, demanded it. Factory supervisor Mira Castell managed Line 12 through pharmaceutical mediation rather than intimidation. When tensions arose, personality conflicts, performance stress, family grief affecting workplace focus, she used Patience Deep for herself and recommended appropriate comfort medications for struggling subordinates. The dose slowed speech, widened listening, kept fingers steady around volatile feedstock. Her factory maintained steady output while reporting 40% fewer disciplinary incidents. Workers respected rather than feared her authority. Correction came as counsel, not cudgel. Tunnel rat Dex Harrow crawled maintenance arteries beneath Sump District Tharsis with pain null calibrated to sub-addictive thresholds. When rock shifted or rebar sliced, 2 notches restored function without euphoria. Medical oversight tracked dosage. Rotation schedules prevented tolerance buildup. Harrow worked hazardous assignments for 15 years without developing chronic pain or pharmaceutical dependence. The tunnels respected that bargain. He returned home with scars cataloged and hands that still held a cup. This represented the quiet bargain. Work productively, and society will mitigate the cost to your soul. Citizens suffered inevitably, but not unnecessarily. The pharmaceutical network absorbed individual distress before it could metastasize into social disruption. Comfort became preventive governance. Small mercies dispensed to prevent larger rebellions. But this gentleness bred dangerous assumptions. Citizens expected suffering to be acknowledged, pain to be treated, emotional distress to warrant institutional response. They developed what Imperial doctrine would later classify as comfort dependency, the heretical belief that human suffering should be minimized rather than embraced. Faith, decoupled from zeal and cushioned by predictable kindness, lost its callous. More troubling, they lost vigilance. A population cushioned against inevitable pain becomes unprepared for deliberate cruelty. Hab wards calibrated to expect relief grew startled when it failed to arrive. No one rehearsed endurance for its own sake. No one practiced saying no to pain. Every gentle buffer trained reflexes toward asking and receiving, assuming tomorrow would bring another dose. Did this gentleness mask fatal weakness in the face of true horror? What external forces were already moving against this fragile peace? They watched sorrow fall long before the fires came. Patient accountants of sin in gray seal scripts and red wax, measuring devotion like grain quotas and cataloging mercy like contraband. The first warnings arrived as numbers, tithe ledgers marked adequate, devotion audits grading satisfactory, resilience indices trailing sector averages. In imperial calculus, adequate means not grateful enough. Satisfactory means not desperate enough. Inquisitor Mordian Vex entered the record with cold precision. Ordo Hereticus, Puritan designation, specialist in spiritual deviation. His surveillance reports dissected Sorrow Fall's gentle rhythms with surgical detachment. Chapel attendance, regular but comfortable. Work quotas, met without glorious excess. Citizen complaints, processed through pharmaceutical mitigation rather than prayer and penance. Each observation built toward a damning conclusion. Here was a world that believed suffering should be treated rather than embraced. The intercepted communications reveal escalating concern. An ecclesiarchy inspector filed, homilies sincere, zeal tepid. A munitorum adjutant noted, stress incidents resolved through pharmacological intervention, not spiritual fortification. A Schola tutor reported unmuscled spirits among conscripts from Sorrowfall. Individually, these assessments meant little. Together, they outlined a planet that had institutionalized weakness. Vex's theological analysis proved decisive. His classified memoranda identified Sorrowfall's pharmaceutical comfort as systematic spiritual corruption, masquerading as medical necessity. Citizens who sought chemical relief for emotional distress demonstrated comfort dependency incompatible with imperial service. Their faith, cushioned by predictable kindness, lacked the desperate edge that marked proper imperial piety. They approached the emperor as benevolent protector rather than demanding master, sang hymns of celebration rather than lamentation. Most damning was Vex's central thesis. Addiction to ease catalyzes appetite for greater indulgence. Citizens unaccustomed to necessary suffering become vulnerable to Slaneshi promises of endless pleasure. He never named the Prince of Excess directly in open channels, but every footnote pointed toward that ultimate corruption. The pharmacy lists, somnus mild, grief ease, confidence mild, became exhibits in a case for spiritual treason. The tragic irony crystallized in classified assessments. Every quality that made Sorrowfall humane was interpreted as evidence of heretical deviation. Compassion for individual suffering became spiritual laxity. Institutional care for emotional distress became systematic weakness. The systematic reduction of unnecessary pain became avoidance of purifying hardship. What the world considered civic duty, the Imperium condemned as spiritual crime. Departamento Munitorum, analysts supported the theological concerns with productivity comparisons. While Sorrowfall met quotas, neighboring worlds driven by controlled desperation consistently exceeded targets. Comfort bred complacency, suffering bred efficiency. Citizens motivated by managed hardship worked longer, accepted worse conditions, demonstrated greater compliance with arbitrary authority. Vex's final recommendation was surgical: spiritual rehabilitation through controlled suffering. Eliminate comfort infrastructure. Transform citizens from ease seekers into suffering servants. The Imperium had identified its enemy, not rebellion, but kindness itself. How does the Imperium justify destroying mercy in the name of salvation? What specific trigger brought the cleansing to Sorrowfall? Correction arrived not as orbital bombardment, but as administrative precision. Departamento Munitorum. Classification. Theta 7 designated Sorrowfall for spiritual rehabilitation through systematic hardship, not exterminatus, which was reserved for worlds beyond salvage, but calculated transformation of institutional mercy into imperial utility. The pharmaceutical infrastructure that had cushioned citizen suffering would be surgically removed and inverted to serve opposite purposes. The operational directive materialized in sealed volumes stamped with inquisitorial authority. 3 phases defined the prescription for purity: elimination of non-essential psychological dependencies, optimization of spiritual resilience through controlled suffering, replacement of individual comfort with collective purpose. Each phrase carried the weight of theological inevitability, wrapped in bureaucratic antiseptic. Phase 1 targeted the comfort infrastructure through systematic reclassification. Somnus mild became sleep avoidance enabling spiritual laxity. Grief ease transformed into mourning mitigation, preventing proper imperial sorrow. Confidence mild was redesignated as anxiety suppression inhibiting necessary vigilance. Every comfort medication received theological reinterpretation that justified elimination as spiritual necessity rather than administrative. Cruelty. Phase 2 addressed personnel disposition through categorical sorting. The comfort class, pharmacists, wellness coordinators, grief counselors, faced vocational rehabilitation rather than execution. Category A, redeemable personnel for transfer to spiritual fortification centers. Category B, recalcitrant elements for off-world redemption labor details. Category C, exemplar conversions for public testimonials demonstrating the joy of deprivation. Elena Caney and her colleagues would not die but be repurposed, their pharmaceutical knowledge redirected toward dispensing controlled hardship rather than unauthorized relief. Phase 3 demonstrated horrifying institutional imagination through infrastructure inversion. Where Pharmacia Benedictus once distributed Focus Calm, new facilities would provide vigilance stimulants preventing rest. Where grief counselors prescribed sorrow ease, spiritual advisors would mandate mourning amplifiers deepening emotional pain. The same distribution networks, appointment systems, and civic trust would serve suffering rather than solace. Citizens paying identical costs for opposite services. Budgetary allocations revealed calculated precision. 7% of civic funds previously dedicated to pharmacological comfort would redirect to spiritual fortification programs. The economic burden remained constant while spiritual outcomes reversed completely. Citizens would learn to interpret pharmaceutical suffering as evidence of improved faith rather than institutional cruelty. The ideological framework supporting these changes demonstrated imperial efficiency. Doctrine would teach that previous comfort represented theft from the emperor's suffering, that individual ease weakened devotional capacity, that pharmaceutical mercy enabled spiritual laziness incompatible with proper service. Resistance would be managed through educational initiatives explaining the spiritual benefits of mandated hardship. Implementation timelines showed bureaucratic inevitability. Voluntary transition periods would gradually reduce comfort availability. Full conversion would complete within 18 months, creating a population that suffered by prescription and called it salvation. Compliance metrics, weekly resilience indices, zeal quotients, penitent throughput would quantify the replacement of kindness with utility. This was not random destruction, but calculated transformation of human kindness into imperial service. How do citizens react when their sources of comfort are systematically eliminated? What becomes of those who provided mercy in a system that has declared mercy heretical? The Hive learned to hear absence. Pharmaceutical convoys that should have arrived on schedule simply did not come. Pneumatic tubes that normally delivered requisition approvals spat back slips stamped under review. Wellness coordinators vanished into temporary reassignment, their offices locked, their appointment books abandoned mid-sentence. The systematic withdrawal of comfort began not with proclamation, but with empty shelves and bureaucratic silence. Elena Caney maintained Pharmacia Benedictus with deliberate normalcy, polishing counters that gleamed like altars to a fading faith. Her inventory dwindled daily. Somnus Mild rationed to half doses, Grief Ease reserved for emergency prescriptions, Focus Calm distributed with apologetic explanations about supply disruptions. She smiled as if scarcity were temporary inconvenience rather than calculated elimination, her professional composure a final gift to citizens who sensed approaching darkness they could not name. Mrs. Valdris arrived Tuesday morning with trembling hands and prescription chit worn soft from folding. 3 weeks of widowhood had carved hollow spaces in her chest that ordinary breath could not fill. The Grief Ease helped, not erasure, but cushioning that made mourning bearable rather than consuming. Caney weighed the remaining bottles with professional gravity, knowing this would be the last prescription she could honor. Behind the counter, her final inventory sat like condemned prisoners awaiting execution. The pharmacy's atmosphere thickened with controlled panic. Citizens queued with collapsed voices, requesting 2 months' supply, just in case. Parents brought wide-eyed children and collected night rest like talismans against unspoken weather. Dex Harrow limped in from Tharsis tunnels with torn sleeve and desperate eyes, pleading for pain null, 1 notch stronger. Mira Castell purchased Patience Deep for herself and Focus Calm for feuding workers, each transaction weighted with finality. Neither customer nor pharmacist acknowledged aloud. Late evenings after closing, Caney performed desperate preservation. She photographed prescription records, copied patient histories, transcribed testimonials from citizens whose lives had improved through pharmaceutical mercy. Some intuition deeper than conscious knowledge drove this documentation. As if she understood these records would become archaeological evidence of vanished approaches to human suffering. She sealed them in waterproof containers, hiding them within the shop's foundation walls where future generations might discover proof that comfort had once been considered compatible with duty. The last normal interactions carried poignant weight. A young clerk thanked Caney for confidence mild that had enabled promotion and marriage. A grandmother described how night rest helped her grandson sleep peacefully after witnessing industrial accidents. A tunnel worker praised Pain Null for keeping hands steady during dangerous repairs. Each testimony celebrated pharmaceutical mercy that would soon be reinterpreted as spiritual weakness, requiring correction. Thursday brought empty delivery shuttles and official notices. Temporary suspension of non-essential pharmaceutical services pending. Administrative review. Citizens gathered outside, reading bureaucratic language that meant their sources of comfort had been severed without warning. The gentle economy that had cushioned their suffering died with administrative efficiency. No dramatic announcement, just locked dispensaries and abandoned hope. What happens when a society built on permitted comfort faces mandated suffering? Will any record of this gentler time survive what comes next? Morning sirens did not wail. Clipboards did. The cleansing began with file numbers and rubber stamps, then boots. Imperial Guard Cadian. 47th descended through hive lifts with methodical precision, flanked by ecclesiarchy purifiers in ash-white tabards. Vox amplifiers announced a public health intervention. This was not conquest, but correction. Systematic elimination of comfort infrastructure through bureaucratic violence wrapped in spiritual necessity. Mrs. Valdris pressed against her hab window as armored figures surrounded Pharmacia Benedictus. Las Bayonettes shattered the dispensary cases. Glass fell like sleet over labeled mercies. Somnus mild bottles exploded against walls, their contents mixing with grief ease in puddles that reflected emergency lighting. A sergeant read from prepared script, "Citizens of Sorrowfall, your addiction to ease has been diagnosed. Imperial intervention provides the cure." Elena Caney emerged from behind her counter with hands raised in final service. She clutched bottles of night rest for children, Pain Null for workers, desperate to distribute final doses before purifiers arrived. A guardsman struck the medications from her grasp, sending them spinning across broken glass. As they dragged her toward re-education transports, she called back, "Remember that medicine once meant mercy." The children screamed loudest. Parents watched in horror as purifiers confiscated night rest from tiny hands, explaining that sleep aids prevented necessary vigilance against heretical thoughts. 7-year-old Marcus Thane wept as soldiers pried anxiety medication away, his father Jorik pleading that the boy needed chemical help to function. A purifier responded with theological precision, "Anxiety is the Emperor's gift. Medication is spiritual theft." Block by block, the cleansing proceeded with administrative thoroughness. Pharmacy after pharmacy received identical treatment. Dispensary cases smashed, inventory confiscated, personnel arrested for spiritual rehabilitation. Public pyres consumed sorrow ease, focus calm, and patience deep, while purifiers chanted litanies explaining how pharmaceutical mercy had weakened souls through unauthorized relief. Dex Harrow collapsed outside Tunnel Medical Station as soldiers confiscated his Pain Null. 15 years of careful dosage management ended in a single bureaucratic moment. Mira Castell watched helplessly as her patience deep joined the flames, chemical assistance that had enabled humane leadership now branded as spiritual weakness. The violence carried bureaucratic precision rather than passionate fury. Each action followed written procedure, every confiscation supported by theological documentation. Citizens were not murdered, but cured of comfort dependency. Resistance was managed through educational initiatives explaining the spiritual benefits of mandated hardship. By evening, comfort infrastructure lay in ruins. A purifier climbed a ladder above Pharmacia Benedictus and veiled the brass motto, "Comfort in service of the soul," in black cloth. He nailed it down with 3 strokes that sounded like the end of a language. The Imperium had not destroyed a world, but corrected it, replacing individual care with collective suffering, pharmaceutical mercy with mandated hardship. How does a population adjust when comfort itself becomes heretical? What new forms of care does the Imperium provide to replace the destroyed mercy? The corner reopened with familiar infrastructure and inverted sacrament. Where Pharmacia Benedictus once stood, Spiritual Fortification Center Benedictus preserved identical floor plans, counterplacement, and appointment systems. The brass motto remained visible, the black cloth removed to reveal new words hammered over the old, "Suffering in service of the soul." The Imperium had not eliminated pharmaceutical control. It had weaponized it. Citizens queued with practiced ritual but opposite intent. Intake began with theological triage, an adept measuring pulse while a confessor measured contrition. Forms recorded resilience indices and vigilance deficits. Behind familiar counters, a menu of sanctioned torments. Penance inducers creating manageable pain to strengthen the soul. Vigilance stimulants preventing rest to maintain alertness against heresy. Humility compounds, inducing anxiety to prevent spiritual pride. Mrs. Valdris approached the same window where Elena Caney once dispensed mercy. The purifier pharmacist prescribed grief amplifiers, compounds that deepened sorrow to ensure proper mourning of the emperor's sacrifices. The medication cost identical credits from identical budgets. Only molecular purpose had inverted. Where chemistry once cushioned pain, it now magnified suffering. The pharmaceutical inversions followed systematic logic. Joric Thane received confidence crusher instead of confidence mild, chemicals triggering panic responses during social interaction, ensuring appropriate humility before authority. Mira Castell's patience deep became urgency inducer, creating constant stress that supervisors channeled into productivity increases. Dex Harrow's pain null transformed into pain amplifier, making every tunnel injury a theological lesson through magnified agony. The horrific revelation crystallized. The Imperium's cure for pharmaceutical dependency was deeper pharmaceutical dependency, designed to cause rather than alleviate suffering. Citizens still received chemical assistance for emotional states, still paid identical costs for medical intervention, still trusted civic infrastructure to manage psychological needs. Every mechanism remained intact, every purpose inverted. Attendance was mandatory, tracked through compliance readers that blinked green for scheduled suffering. Weekly allotments were calibrated not to individual need, but to perceived spiritual deficiency. The same cues that once promised relief now delivered daily doses of sanctified torment, dispensed with clinical detachment by grim-faced apothecaries who measured suffering like Elena Kane once measured mercy. Mrs. Valdris swallowed her grief amplifier with ritual devotion, once reserved for grief ease. The chemistry worked perfectly. Her sorrow deepened into theological instruction. Personal mourning transformed into collective demonstration of proper imperial piety. Around her, citizens adapted to pharmaceutical desperation with the same institutional trust they once placed in pharmaceutical comfort. The corner where dreams were sold had become the corner where nightmares were prescribed. Same infrastructure, same budget allocation, same civic trust, but serving suffering rather than solace through systematic perversion of medical care itself. How do citizens adapt to a system that weaponizes the very concept of medical care? What becomes of those who remember when medicine meant mercy? The creed changed first, Then the chemistry followed. Ecclesiarchy doctrine rewrote pain into prayer through systematic theological instruction, distributed via the same civic channels that once carried wellness pamphlets. Public address systems echoed new catechisms. Comfort is theft from the emperor's suffering. Individual ease weakens the soul's devotion. Pharmaceutical mercy enables spiritual laziness incompatible with proper service. The phrases repeated until they became policy, then reflex. Mandatory suffering seminars replaced wellness coordination in repurposed civic halls. Confessor Thaddeus Grimm, installed where Elena Caney once practiced mercy, preached pharmaceutical theology to citizens seated on deliberately uncomfortable benches. The curriculum was methodical: pain as prayer, anxiety as vigilance, exhaustion as devotion. Each pharmaceutical torment received scriptural justification through careful doctrinal interpretation. Visual displays contrasted the spiritual decay of pre-cleansing comfort with the purifying fire of present hardship. Jorik Thane learned to interpret Confidence Crusher as spiritual instruction rather than chemical torture. Where Confidence Mild once steadied his voice, the new compound triggered panic responses during social interaction. Seminars taught him to catalog symptoms aloud: proper humility manifest, speech curtailed, pride repelled. Supervisors marked improved docility and increased reliance on guidance. His work performance declined, but authorities praised his newfound theological awareness. Mira Castell discovered pharmaceutical leadership through inverse chemistry. Patience Destroyer replaced Patience Deep, creating constant urgency that supervisors channeled into productivity increases. Where she once managed workers through understanding, she now drove them through anxiety that passed for appropriate zeal. Her factory output increased 20%, while worker satisfaction plummeted, metrics the Imperium interpreted as spiritual improvement through necessary hardship. Dex Harrow sanctified tunnel work through magnified agony. Pain Amplifier transformed every scrape into theological instruction, each injury becoming evidence of devotional correctness. Seminars taught him to interpret suffering as communion with the Emperor's eternal torment. His work grew dangerous as pain overwhelmed concentration, but purifiers praised his willingness to sacrifice physical comfort for spiritual advancement. The system's efficiency was terrifying because it felt familiar. Same cues, same appointment schedules, same civic trust, but serving suffering rather than solace through systematic inversion of medical purpose. Citizens who once sought pharmaceutical relief now queued for pharmaceutical torment with identical institutional faith. Compliance readers blinked green when citizens collected their mandated hurt, measuring suffering indices and devotional intensity levels. Weekly assessments tracked pharmaceutical suffering like former wellness metrics. Citizens competed to demonstrate proper chemical agony, interpreting torture as evidence of improved faith. The same social dynamics that once supported comfort-seeking now reinforced suffering acceptance through peer pressure disguised as theological correctness. Sorrowfall had been converted from managed contentment to administered deprivation, a civilization that suffers by prescription and calls it salvation. What psychological toll does mandated pharmaceutical suffering exact on the human spirit? Do any remnants of the old comfort system survive in hidden forms? Elena Caney survived through bureaucratic oversight. Her transport manifest lost during administrative transition. Her detention order misfiled between departments. While purifiers searched for escaped comfort class personnel, she vanished into abandoned hab blocks beneath Sump District Tharsis, carrying salvaged medical supplies and uncompromising purpose. In forgotten maintenance chambers where official oversight failed to penetrate, she rebuilt pharmacy as resistance. The network formed around shared desperation and professional oath. Former wellness coordinators, grief counselors, and pharmacy technicians assembled in a disused atmospheric processing station. medical equipment powered by jury-rigged generators and shielded by industrial dampeners. Their weapons were kindness, their ammunition measured in milliliters of mercy. Operating procedures followed liturgical precision. No repeats within 5 rotations, never treat in identical locations, carry decoy vials for surrender, use coded phrases for different medications. Citizens arrived broken by the liturgy of necessary pain. Jorik Thane crawled through ventilation shafts with hands that shook uncontrollably from confidence crusher overdose. His productivity collapsed as pharmaceutical terror overwhelmed basic function. Caney administered pre-cleansing confidence mild in careful doses, providing temporary stability that allowed sleep and coherent speech. For 6 hours, he remembered normal anxiety rather than chemical panic designed to demonstrate spiritual humility. Dex Harrow reached them through maintenance tunnels, his work-related injuries magnified beyond function by pain amplifier. Traditional analgesics provided blessed intervals where torn muscles felt appropriately painful rather than theologically instructive. He could concentrate on repairs without agony overwhelming competence, returning home with manageable rather than sanctified hurt. The moral arithmetic cut both ways. Providing comfort violated imperial doctrine and risked not execution, but spiritual rehabilitation. Chemical conversion that left victims grateful for their torment. Yet, watching citizens suffer unnecessarily violated every medical oath Caney had sworn. Each treatment became theological rebellion, every dose of mercy, a declaration that human suffering should be minimized rather than maximized. Operational security demanded constant vigilance. Confessors noted households whose insomnia suddenly improved. Patrol routes shifted toward districts where citizens displayed unauthorized wellness. The network operated knowing their mercy was temporary, their resistance ultimately doomed by systematic elimination of pharmaceutical compassion. Supplies dwindled without replacement. Discovery meant conversion rather than martyrdom. But citizens continued arriving. Parents seeking sleep aids for children, driven insomniac by vigilant stimulants. Supervisors requesting anxiety relief that enabled humane rather than terrorized management. Each treatment demonstrated that comfort remained possible, even when declared heretical. Caney triaged by harm, the child before the clerk, the wounded before the weary, the suicidal before the sleepless. Risk accumulated as fast as gratitude. On walls above her workbench, Caney maintained inventories beside evacuation plans, measuring remaining supplies against approaching discovery. How long can mercy survive in a system designed to eliminate it? What happens when the Imperium discovers this underground compassion? Inquisitor Mordian Vex tracked mercy like pathogen transmission, mapping unauthorized wellness through surveillance algorithms that detected comfort's forensic traces. Citizens displaying improved sleep patterns triggered investigation. Households reporting reduced. Anxiety drew scrutiny. The underground pharmacy's kindness left statistical signatures that sophisticated monitoring eventually decoded. Elena Kane's network betrayed by the very relief it provided. The raids came with clinical precision rather than violence. Servo skulls sealed corridors, while Vox units broadcast assurances of curative opportunity. Caney surrendered without resistance, her medical oath preventing harm even in self-defense. Vex observed from behind armored glass, dictating notes that cataloged compassion like contraband. Unauthorized alleviation confirmed. Subject attitudes, recalcitrant, sentimental, correctable. Execution would have been wasteful. Vex prescribed conversion through the Reformation theater, sterile chambers where pharmaceutical torture wore pedagogical vestments. The regimen began with systematic neurochemical restructuring using compounds that inverted fundamental emotional responses. Where Caney once experienced satisfaction from alleviating pain, new neural pathways generated euphoria from witnessing suffering. Where she once felt revulsion at cruelty, Redesigned brain chemistry produced nausea at displays of comfort. The conditioning paired chemistry with catechism through precise protocols. Grief ease, administered in trace doses, was chemically bound to emetics. Comfort triggered violent nausea. Penance inducers, pulsed through dermal needles, released endorphin spikes when pain reached predetermined thresholds. Agony precipitated relief. Between injections, confessors droned looped litanies. Ease is theft. Suffering is gift. Mercy is pride. Pain is obedience. 18 days of chemical intervention rewrote synaptic pathways until Elena Kane's professional knowledge became weapon against her own compassion. The transformation was complete and authentic. The woman who once distributed comfort now experienced genuine joy when administering pharmaceutical torture, felt physically ill when observing kindness, and interpreted her previous mercy as spiritual corruption requiring eternal penance. Her conversion carried devastating sincerity because chemistry guaranteed it, not coerced performance but neurological reality. The Imperium deployed her as both punishment and propaganda. Before assembled citizens, Kaney emerged in service gray to demonstrate zealous support for the suffering she once alleviated. She swallowed measured doses of penance inducer and smiled through trembling. When offered pre-cleansing somnus mild, she gagged before it touched her tongue, weeping apologies for her old thefts. Former patients watched in horror. Jorik Thane lowered his eyes as Kaney praised Confidence Crusher for saving his soul from pride. Mrs. Valdris felt deeper grief than any grief amplifier could induce, witnessing her beloved pharmacist transformed into advocate for cruelty. Dex Harrow stood with ruined knee while catechisms celebrated the sanctity of his magnified pain. The Yairi underground network dissolved as members witnessed their leader's conversion. Resistance became impossible when mercy itself had been perverted into its opposite through pharmaceutical precision. What is the final psychological cost of living in a world where mercy itself has been perverted? Can any authentic human feeling survive such systematic brutalization? The children learned new definitions before they learned to read. In Scola Clinics, 17-year-old Cassia Thane collected her daily humility compound with genuine gratitude, understanding medicine as controlled suffering dispensed for spiritual improvement. Treatment meant managed pain calibrated to strengthen devotional capacity. The concept of pharmaceuticals designed to provide comfort was literally incomprehensible, like describing colors to someone born blind, or explaining silence to the perpetually deafened. During routine Hab block renovation, Cassia discovered Elena Kane's waterproof archive beneath the ruins of Pharmacia Benedictus. The containers held pre-cleansing medications, bottles of Somnus Mild, Grief Ease, Confidence Mild, alongside testimonials from citizens whose lives had improved through pharmaceutical mercy. Her reaction was visceral horror. Not programmed response, but authentic revulsion at chemistry designed for kindness rather than correction. Why would anyone want to feel less pain? She asked her father Jorik, holding pain null, like contaminated artifacts. How could reducing anxiety be anything but spiritual weakness? The questions revealed the generational chasm. He remembered when medicine meant relief, while she could not conceive of chemistry serving comfort rather than correction. When he described how Confidence Mild had once steadied his voice, Cassia interpreted this as confession of spiritual corruption requiring therapeutic suffering. The divide manifested with mathematical precision across age cohorts. Citizens over 30 retained cellular memory of pharmaceutical kindness. Their bodies recognized comfort as possible even when their minds accepted suffering as necessary. Those under 25 displayed genuine incomprehension when confronted with pre-cleansing medications, their neural development shaped entirely by the liturgy of necessary pain. Young Medicae apprentice Darius Harrow, son of tunnel worker Dex, studied the archived medications with clinical fascination and theological horror. His training taught him to identify compounds that reduced rather than increased suffering, but his conditioning interpreted such chemistry as evidence of pre-cleansing spiritual decay. He filed reports classifying the medications as historical examples of pharmaceutical heresy, requiring immediate disposal through sanctified incineration. The educational system had achieved perfect inversion. Children attended mandatory historical corruption seminars where crude depictions showed pre-cleansing comfort seekers as weak figures who shirked duty to the emperor. These lessons were reinforced by daily regimens of penance inducers and vigilance stimulants that made pharmaceutical suffering as routine as daily rations. Cassia volunteered to burn the discovered comfort medications in public ceremony, her enthusiasm authentic rather than performed. She had been raised to believe suffering was medicine and comfort was poison, not through coercion, but through systematic education that made pharmaceutical mercy literally unthinkable. Mrs. Valdres watched from her hab window as the flames consumed bottles that once held her grief ease. Her granddaughter stood among the cheering crowd, genuinely grateful for the elimination of heretical kindness. The Imperium had created a generation that preferred pain to peace through complete ideological transformation. What happens to the last generation that remembers pharmaceutical mercy? Is there any way to preserve the memory of a gentler approach to human suffering? Mrs. Valdres walked the familiar route with deliberate fragility, her body a testament to 15 years of pharmaceutical torture. Grief amplifiers had carved channels in her cardiovascular system where manufactured sorrow ran constant and corrosive. Humility compounds had taught her hands to shake reflexively. Ulcers from penance drafts, mapping her digestive tract like theological instruction. At 73, she carried the weight of witness, the last citizen who remembered Elena Kane's gentle hands before chemical conversion transformed compassion into zealous cruelty. Sublevel Gamma-7 smelled of rust and sanctified incense. The spiritual fortification center gleamed above the ruins of Pharmacia Benedictus, its brass motto proclaiming, "Suffering in service of the soul," where older words once promised comfort. Beneath the gleaming efficiency, rubble held memories like amber holds insects, preserved, unreachable, waiting. Her satchel contained relics of vanished mercy, prescription bottles with intact seals, medical records documenting relief rather than amplified pain, testimonials from citizens who remembered when chemistry served healing. The internal struggle consumed her remaining strength. Preserving this history risked posthumous branding as heretical. Her granddaughter would face interrogation, increased pharmaceutical suffering as punishment for ancestral deviation. Yet allowing complete erasure meant the final victory of weaponized healing. She knelt among foundation stones where Elena Kane's counter once stood, fingers finding the loose plasteel panel that concealed the pharmacist's original cache. Inside, waterproof containers held Elena's carefully documented records, inventory lists, patient testimonials, evidence that pharmaceutical mercy had once existed as civic policy rather than heretical fantasy. The discovery steeled her resolve. Working with industrial efficiency, Mrs. Valdres arranged her salvaged evidence alongside Elena's archive. 2 bottles of Somnus Mild with faded labels promising peaceful sleep. Prescription chits signed in Elena's careful script. Data slates containing whispered testimonials from the last generation that remembered comfort as possibility rather than corruption. Each item represented citizens whose suffering had once been considered worth alleviating. Jorik Thane's steadied voice, Mira Castell's patient leadership, Dex Harrow's manageable pain. She sealed the expanded cache with ritual precision, then wrote a final testimony on recycled forms. They did not eliminate pharmaceutical control. They inverted it. We queued in the same places, paid identical costs, trusted identical systems, but received torture where we once found relief. To whoever inherits this corner, medicine once meant mercy. The note went beneath the brass motto's rivet, where searching fingers might discover it generations hence. She pressed her palm against the counter where Elena once measured doses of kindness, allowing herself one unprescribed comfort. The thought that record could outlast decree, that buried truth might survive institutional lies. Above, citizens queued for their daily suffering with grateful devotion. Below, sealed in darkness, evidence waited in waterproof silence, a whispered dialogue between mercy and its memory. Will future generations ever rediscover the concept of pharmaceutical mercy? What is the ultimate legacy of a world that chose to weaponize healing? The queue forms with liturgical precision on sub-level Gamma 7, citizens arranging themselves in the same coordinates where their grandparents once sought pharmaceutical mercy. Penance distribution. Point: Benedictus occupies the identical footprint of Pharmacia Benedictus, its architecture preserved but purpose systematically inverted through ideological reconstruction. Above the entrance, fresh marble proclaims the revised sacrament, suffering in service of the soul. The transformation is complete yet familiar. Same counter height, identical appointment systems, preserved brass fittings polished to devotional gleam. Servo skulls process ident tags with bureaucratic efficiency, logging resilience indices and spiritual fortification metrics. Vox panels murmur the established liturgy. Pain is prayer. Anxiety is vigilance. Exhaustion is devotion. Every mechanism endures, every purpose inverted. Cassia Thane approaches the dispensary window with ritualistic solemnity. 22 years old, born 3 years after the cleansing, her understanding of medicine begins and ends with sanctified suffering. She presents her prescription chit to the purifier pharmacist, a figure trained in Elena Kane's techniques, but serving opposite purposes. The transaction follows familiar protocols: pharmaceutical assessment, dosage calculation, civic payment processing. Humility inducer, standard adult dose, the purifier announces, measuring compounds that trigger anxiety responses during social interaction. Pain sanctifier, labor grade, follows, chemistry designed to amplify workplace injuries into theological instruction. Cassia accepts the vials with genuine gratitude, understanding these medications as pathways to spiritual improvement rather than instruments of torture. She swallows her suffering pills with the same devotional care her grandmother Mira once reserved for patience deep. The chemistry works with pharmaceutical precision. Manufactured anxiety floods her nervous system, while controlled pain transforms minor discomfort into magnified sensation. She interprets these effects as evidence of improved faith, chemical torture experienced as communion with the Emperor's eternal suffering. Around her, citizens collect their daily allocations of sanctified hurt: vigilant stimulants, preventing rest; grief amplifiers, deepening sorrow; confidence crushers, ensuring proper humility. The same cues that once promised relief now deliver measured torment, dispensed with clinical detachment by functionaries who measure suffering like Elena Kane once measured mercy. Directly beneath the gleaming counter, Mrs. Valdris's archive waits in waterproof silence. Sealed containers hold testimony to vanished possibilities. Bottles promising comfort, medical records documenting relief, testimonials from citizens who remembered when chemistry served healing rather than harm. The evidence remains buried like archaeological contradiction, preserved memory of gentler alternatives in a world that has forgotten such alternatives ever existed. The irony completes with mathematical precision. Where dreams were once sold, nightmares are now prescribed through identical infrastructure serving opposite purposes. Cassia departs with chemical agony coursing through her bloodstream, genuinely grateful for torture she interprets as salvation. Behind her, the queue advances with patient devotion, citizens purchasing their daily doses of sanctified hurt with institutional faith, their ancestors once placed in pharmaceutical mercy. The corner endures with perfect perversion, healing weaponized into harm, mercy converted into mandated suffering, pharmaceutical control, preserved but utterly transformed.